The watch was small, brass, and worn smooth by time. It was given to him on the morning he left. A simple gift from his father. "It's been in the family for 3 generations," the old man had said, pressing it into his son's palm. "It's kept working through storms, famine, and worse. Let it remind you that time always moves forward." He remembered the click of the clasp as he fastened it to his uniform pocket. The platform had been crowded with faces, some smiling bravely, others too afraid to. The train hissed, and the air smelled of coal and rain. He waved as the station blurred behind him, not realizing how long it would be before he saw home again, if ever. In the weeks that followed, the watch became more than a tool. It was a ritual. Each morning, before dawn, he would check it. Even when the hands no longer matched the sun, the ticking sound grounded him. It was something that still worked in a world that no longer did. The men joked about it. "You and that old clock." One of them laughed as they crouched in the trench. But when the shelling began, it was the same man who whispered, "Is it still ticking?" The soldier nodded. Somehow it was... He didn't know it yet, but that steady beat, fragile and mechanical, would become his last link to the life he had before the war. Long after his letters stopped and his name was lost to paper, the watch would remain. By the time he reached the front, the watch had already lost its shine. Mud crept into its seams, dulling the brass to the color of the earth. The soldier wiped it clean each night, careful not to drop it into the sludge that swallowed everything else. Around him, the trench stretched endlessly, a carved scar running through France or Belgium or somewhere that no longer had a name. The air was thick with the stench of wet uniforms, cordite, and decay. Rats scurried across the duckboards, bold and fat from feeding well. Men smoked in silence, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and waiting. The soldier checked his watch again, 2:17. It didn't matter. Time had stopped meaning anything here. The sky changed, but the war did not. When the shelling began, it felt less like a battle and more like weather. The ground trembled. Dirt poured from the walls like rain. Somewhere down the line, a man screamed for a medic who would never arrive. The soldier pressed his back against the trench and covered the watch with his hand, as if protecting it could somehow protect himself. When the barrage finally ended, he looked down. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at 2:19. He exhaled slowly. "Still works," he murmured, though it didn't. The lie was small, harmless, necessary. Around him, others began to move again, shaking mud from helmets and lighting cigarettes. The moment passed, but from that day on, the watch no longer told time. It kept something else, the memory of when time had stopped for him and for so many others. Mail day was the only thing that reminded the men there was still a world beyond the wire. The soldier watched as letters were passed down the trench, names shouted over the din. Some men laughed, others cried. A few just held the envelopes without opening them, as if afraid that touching home might make it disappear. His name was not called. It rarely was. He didn't know if the post had been lost, or if there was simply nothing left to send. Instead, he reached for his watch, turning it over his hands. The crack in the glass had spread like a spider's web, catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the fog. It was still stopped at 2:19. He thought about writing his own letter. He'd written a few in the beginning, bright words about honor, duty, and victory, but the paper always ended up damp. The ink running before the censor's stamp could reach it. Lately, there was nothing left to say. What could one write about a world of mud and waiting? The men beside him began to read their letters aloud. Words of fields, children, and warm kitchens filled the air like ghosts. For a few moments, it almost sounded like life again. Then the shells started falling. The paper scattered. Voices turned to shouting. The moment was gone. After it ended, the soldier retrieved a torn page that had blown into his section of trench. It wasn't his, but he kept it anyway, a single line still legible beneath the mud. "We wait for you to come home." He folded it and tucked it next to the stopwatch. That night he couldn't sleep. The watch ticked faintly in his dreams, steady, relentless, impossible. At dawn, the order came down the line. The assault would begin at first light. The soldier sat quietly, listening to the murmurs around him. Some men prayed. Others joked, small, brittle laughter that vanished quickly into the mist. A sergeant passed by, reminding them to fix bayonets and check rifles. The soldier looked instead at the watch in his palm. The hand still pointed to 219. It was strange, he thought, how something broken could feel so steady. When the whistles blew, the world erupted. He climbed a ladder and stepped into no man's land, the mud sucking at his boots. Ahead, the horizon flashed white with artillery. The air was alive with noise, the deep thunder of guns, the hiss of bullets, the sharp cries of men falling. He moved forward almost mechanically, eyes fixed on the patch of earth ahead. The ground was torn and cratered, littered with the fragments of uniforms and lives. He stumbled, fell into a shell hole, and pressed his body against the cold mud as shrapnel screamed overhead. The watch lay against his chest, its weight small but constant, as if reminding him that every second here cost something enormous. A voice shouted his name, or maybe it was someone else's. He couldn't tell. He crawled forward, through smoke and wire, until the shapes ahead began to move, the enemy trenches half collapsed, still firing. He raised his rifle and fired back, not out of hate or courage, but reflex. By the time the whistles blew again, the line had moved a few hundred meters, at a cost he couldn't count. He dropped into a captured trench and sat in the dirt, breathing hard. The watch had stopped long ago, but he still checked it. The cracked glass caught the dawn light again, and for a brief second, he thought it looked beautiful. After the assault, time lost all meaning. The soldier could not say whether hours or days had passed. The sun rose, or perhaps it didn't. The sky was the same dull gray either way. The trench they now held was barely a trench at all, just a torn groove filled with bodies and broken boards. He sat against the wall, trying to clean his rifle with trembling hands. The mud clung to everything, even his thoughts. He reached into his tunic and felt the familiar shape of the watch. The glass was cold, the hand still unmoving. For a moment, he wondered if he should throw it away. What good was a broken watch here? But he couldn't do it. He turned it over instead, rubbing at the brass casing until a faint gleam showed through the grime. He remembered his father's voice. Time always moves forward. Nearby, a young recruit was talking softly to no one. His eyes were vacant, fixed on the sky. "It's still morning," he said, though the light suggested otherwise. Another man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Morning, night, what's the difference?" The soldier looked down again. The watch reflected a fragment of the sky, the same color as the boy's eyes. He closed it and slipped it back into his pocket. Somewhere behind them, the gun started again. The ground shook, dislodging clumps of wet earth that fell like rain. He realized then that it wasn't the stopwatch that disturbed him. It was the ticking he could still hear in his head, a rhythm that didn't match the world anymore, a rhythm that reminded him there was once before, and maybe somewhere beyond this, and after, when night came, he slept without knowing it. The ticking followed him into dreams. At first light, a runner appeared, stumbling down the line with mud caked his face. He carried messages, folded, smudged orders passed hand to hand. The soldier helped him over the boards, offering a canteen. The young man nodded, breathless. "They're sending relief by nightfall," he said. His voice was thin, as if he didn't believe it himself. The soldier noticed a tremor in his hands. He recognized it, the mark of those who had seen too much too soon. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the watch. "Here," he said, pressing it into the runner's palm. "For luck." The boy frowned. "It's broken." The soldier smiled faintly. "So are we." For a long moment, the runner said nothing. Then he closed his fingers around the watch. "I'll bring it back." The soldier nodded, though he knew the promise meant nothing. No one brought anything back from here. Not watches, not letters, not men. By the time relief came, the soldier was gone. No one saw him fall. They found only the mud where he had been sitting and a folded scrap of paper in his pocket. A single line from a letter that wasn't his. "We wait for you to come home." Somewhere beyond the trenches, the runner kept moving. He carried the messages through shell fire, through the rain, through the endless noise. He carried the watch too, though he didn't know why. When he reached the next position, he checked it instinctively, as if time still mattered. The hands remained frozen at 2:19. He smiled weakly and tucked it away. The sound of guns rolled on, and he started running again toward the next set of waiting hands, and the next. When the war finally ended, the silence was heavier than the gunfire had ever been. Men stood in the ruins of the trenches, unsure whether to cheer or simply breathe. The runner, now older by years he had never lived, sat beside a heap of abandoned rifles. His uniform hung loose on him. His eyes were distant, unblinking. He reached into his pocket and drew out the watch. The brass had darkened completely, the face buried beneath scratches and grime. It was still stopped at 2:19. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, revealing a faint engraving on the back. "For when you return." The words were almost gone, worn smooth by mud and time. The runner didn't know the man who had owned it, not even his name. But he carried it with a kind of reverence, as though it belonged to all of them, every soldier who had waited, every one who hadn't returned. When transport arrived to take them home, he slipped it into a tin box along with a handful of papers and tags from the fallen. It was marked simply, "Effects Unknown Soldier." The box traveled by train, then by ship, then by train again across a continent still healing. Somewhere along the way, the watch stopped being someone's possession and became a record instead, a small, silent testimony to the exact moment when one life had ended and history had continued. Years later, it would be unpacked in a quiet government storeroom, cataloged, and placed in a drawer. No one wounded. No one tried to fix it. It had done its work. And so the watch rested, not moving, not measuring time, but holding it still. Decades passed. The war that was meant to end all wars became a chapter in history books, a collection of names etched into stone. In a museum gallery lined with artifacts, the watch sat behind glass, cataloged, labeled, preserved. Pocket watch, circa 1916. Found near the Western Front. Owner unknown. Visitors stopped to look at it, though few lingered long. Some noticed a crack in the glass, others the hands fixed forever at 2:19. Most moved on to the uniforms and medals, the maps of battles whose names had long since blurred together. But every so often, someone paused. A veteran, perhaps, leaning on his cane, tracing the air above the display. Or a schoolchild staring with quiet curiosity. They would ask, "Did it really stop at that time?" And the guide would nod. "Yes," she would say softly. No one knows why. The light from the window struck the brass just right, making it gleam faintly, as if time still moved inside it, unseen. For a moment, the glass reflected faces not of visitors, but the men who had once carried it. Mud-smeared, tired, waiting. The illusion lasted only a second, but it was enough. The watch had become what its owner never could, a survivor. It no longer measured seconds, but memory, the slow pulse of everything left behind. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed, clocks chimed the hour, and people hurried through their lives, unaware that in a quiet room, behind a pane of glass, time had stopped a long time ago and never started again.